About the NHS, but let's go to other matters and hear from the Justice Secretary, who's introducing a ministerial block on releasing murderers, terrorists and rapists. Dominic Raab, who's also the Deputy Prime Minister, will fight criminals who, it says here, launch spurious legal claims to try to get out of time behind bars. Dominic Raab, Deputy Prime Minister, Justice Secretary, joins me now to explain more. Can you define what is, in your view, a spurious legal claim then, Deputy Prime Minister? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Well, look, in relation to the ministerial veto, by the way, it includes the high list of the top risk cohort you described, but also those who unlawfully kill a child. We're just being very clear that in relation to those cases, there ought to be a ministerial check in the interests of public protection to make sure we're doing everything we can to keep the public safe. And I'm very confident that the measures we're taking are robust, they're lawful, and that we can see off any unmeritorious claims that might arise.
It says here in one newspaper, The Sun, you want to take parole board decision-making, quotes, in a different direction, close quotes, putting public protection at the heart of new legislation. Can you expand on that a little bit, Deputy Prime Minister?
Yes, of course. So I think there's been a drift away from its original moorings from the statutory test on public protection, which the Parole Board manages. In effect, it ought to be exclusively focused on public protection, particularly for the most serious cases, not engaged, in my view, in a balancing act with the interests of offenders or rehabilitation or proportionality. I want to get it back, so we're going to change the criteria and be more prescriptive. Public protection is the exclusive focus. Secondly, when it comes to the parole board panels, I was surprised to learn that in fewer than 1 in 20 cases, they are manned by those with any law enforcement experience at all. So we've got quite a lot of social scientists, psychiatrists, psychologists on there, judicial members, and that's right. But I do also think there ought to be a grittier, more grizzled law enforcement membership of those parole board panels. And then finally, for the top tier cohort of the most serious risk of serious further offenders, the murderers, the rapists, the terrorist offenders and the child killers, I think on a precautionary basis, there ought to be a ministerial check so that Secretary of State can block release. I think that's right for the interests of public protection. I think it's right for reinforcing public confidence in the system.
So the relevant Secretary of State could actually trump a parole board decision, just to clarify, Secretary of State.
Yes, and I think if you look at some of the earlier cases, I don't want to make it too focused on individuals, but if you look at Warboys, the John Warboys case, if you look at the case of Colin Pitchfork...
Just to remind my listeners, it's known as the Black Cab rapist, and Colin Pitchfork, of course, was found guilty of the murder of 2 teenage girls in Leicester. On you go, just to inform, I know you know, yes, sir, but just to inform my listeners, Deputy Prime Minister.
No, you're quite right. I think in those kinds of case, people want to know we're doing everything we can to put the threat to them front and centre, everything we do. We talk about the precautionary approach in relation to other kinds of danger where there's very severe consequences, even if the risk is hard to quantify. For example, the environment. I'm taking that approach to what I think most people would think is the right area, which is public protection when someone has already committed a very heinous crime.
You referenced Colin Pitchfork. You're probably aware, Secretary of State, he's due to have his parole hearing next month, but it's going to be heard in private as opposed to public. Why?
Well, that's a decision for the Parole Board. I've introduced measures to increase the transparency, but ultimately...
Do you agree with it?
Well, I think once we've got the rules in place, I need to respect it. But we have increased the transparency. The truth is the Parole Board will look at the interests of the victims, the public, but also a risk to an offender. I don't think we want to be encouraging vigilantism or anything like that. I'm not doing that.
I'm not suggesting vigilantism.
No, I know you're not.
I was merely saying that the sort of the antiseptic light of journalism or public hearings is probably a positive benefit.
I agree with that, and I think there's a presumption now that that should happen, but there needs to be, you need to look at all the circumstances of the case. I've introduced much more transparency on everything from parole board proceedings to the family courts, and we'll keep doing it in that direction. But ultimately, the parole board will decide in individual cases.
How close are you to stopping Levi Belfield enjoying a wedding ceremony behind bars?
Well, look, I never like to make these issues too personalised, but I do think in general terms, where you've got a serial killer or someone else who's been convicted and sentenced to what's called a whole life order, they're never getting out of prison. We need to make sure that confidence in the justice system, and as a matter of safeguarding, those kinds of very dangerous criminals cannot marry. And in this kind of case, I think there is an issue around confidence in the justice system writ large, but I think there's also a safeguarding issue around the kinds of individual that approach these serious criminals. They may often be vulnerable, fragile, you could say gullible. I'm not talking about individual cases, and just make sure that they're not falling into some sort of trap. So as a safeguarding measure, as well as a public confidence measure, the prisoner and the Victims and Prisoner Bill will introduce the ability to block and ban marriage in those cases.
While I have the benefit of you on the line, a question or two about some other matters, one of which has attracted a lot of attention, the idea now that illegal migrants could be placed on these prison ships or possibly on former RAF bases. Coming back to the idea of these barges or whatever we call them, how many boats or barges do we have available?
Well, the first point is that we've got to crush the criminal gangs preying on human misery and lining their pockets on illegal immigration and the small boats trade in particular. We've got to end the perception and the reality of people thinking that at the end of that journey they can be housed in hotels at the cost to the taxpayer and your listeners of £6 million per day. There are cheaper, lower cost but humane forms of accommodation. You've mentioned barges, you've mentioned former military barracks. Nothing is off the table, and the Immigration Minister will set out the detail in the House of Commons in the proper way today.
OK, but how many boats are available?
I don't have that figure. I think,
but there are some, are there? We have got some standing by.
Those details will be set out by the Immigration Minister. Of course, using vessels to do it is not uncommon in other parts of Europe. So, in the last analysis, nothing is off the table. What is definitely off the table is this concept that you can just come here illegally and be housed in a hotel.
But this was, I understand, discussed at Cabinet yesterday. Immigration Minister, it is reported, Robert Jenrick, presumably you were there, took you and your colleagues through. Did someone not say, well, how many boats have we got waiting, Robert?
You know, Nick, I never comment on the private discussions of Cabinet. What I can tell you is the government is full square behind this because we know how many people are suffering as a result and how many gangsters are profiting. That's why we've got to bring it to an end.
All right. But, OK, do you know how many people are currently waiting to have their claims processed, asylum seekers? Do you have that number to hand? I appreciate it's not your brief, but do you have that number to hand?
I don't have the total volume, but
it's 51,000.
Yeah. It's too hard.
How many barges have we got?
Well, we're not talking about putting all these people on barges. We will look across the board, but whether it's the barges or the ex-military barracks, that gives you a flavour that there are lower cost alternatives, and that's what we're going to pursue. OK,
and just lastly on this, so we have got some vessels secured. I appreciate you're not going to share innermost Cabinet detail, but some contracts have been signed with some of these vessels.
I don't know about the detailed contractual position. What I can tell you is we're ending the practice of housing people in hotels, and the Immigration Minister, you won't have to wait too much longer. The Immigration Minister will set all of this out in the House of Commons.
I'm thrilled already. One last subject to explore is the NHS. You are probably aware, rather disappointingly, a survey has come out showing that the British public's loss of faith in the NHS. It's worth saying, not the brilliant men and women, and I'm sure you'd want to pay tribute to them, who are actually staffing our hospitals and our wards and whatever else it might be, and our clinics. But rather problems such as A&E and the backlog. And I have to remind you, as you're probably aware, 13 or so years ago, public confidence in the NHS was at an all-time high. What's happened over the last 13 years? Oh, hang on, the pen has dropped. It's been a Conservative or Conservative-led government. This lands squarely on your watch, doesn't it, Deputy Prime Minister?
Well, you didn't mention the small matter of the global pandemic and the impact that COVID had, not just on the NHS directly, but on the backlogs. But look, the NHS staff do a terrific job. We're putting record levels of funding into it. The waiting lists are down by 64% since the pandemic peak. But the combination of more staff, more resource, and also the reforms that the Health Secretary has been talking about will get back, I'm confident, the levels of patient trust and confidence and satisfaction that we all need to see.
Grateful for your time as ever. Thank you. Dominic Raab, who's Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, appearing here on LBC. It's 9 o'clock. News headlines, Thomas Watts.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.